So this morning we'll have a little time for questions and response. It's been a couple months, I think, since we have done this, and a lot has happened. So we had a couple talks on Lotus Sutra. There was the end of the retreat with the Shosan, the formal question and answer period. There were some talks about Buddha's enlightenment, Kogen's changing of color of robe after his transmission. And maybe we had also feeding the hungry ghosts. Maybe all of that since we've had question and response before. Or maybe not. Maybe there was one in there. I can't remember for sure. And now we're on the threshold of a new year, 2025, which is guaranteed to bring many interesting and exciting things. So I think there's a lot there that may be knocking around in your head or in your heart. And really the purpose of question and response is where our lives can touch the Dharma is when we have a question. Actually, when we kind of know what we're going to do, or we kind of understand, that's not bad. Sometimes it's bad, but it can be good. But actually the sweeter thing, or maybe the thing that provides more guidance, is when we have a question. Because it allows for an openness, for there to be some step that is taken. When we're carrying out what we already understand, that can be important, but it's usually in the process of closing a little bit. Our awareness is getting narrower, whereas in the question, if it's a true question, then our awareness is opening up. And that's why we don't say question answer, we say question response. My job is not to answer your question, is just to respond to the question. And hopefully, if the arrows meet, you will not feel a resolution, but you will feel the power of the question carrying you forward. And that's, I think, a great strength of this particular tradition of Buddhism, which is called Zen Buddhism. The big emphasis on the questions. So let's shaking. Mm-hmm.
A couple of weeks ago in Shosan, I asked you about sort of facing and dealing with the incredible suffering in the world that's going on. The conversation ended with you saying, well, there's the cosmic mudra. And the cosmic mudra is what we hold in our sitting. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the cosmic mudra is teaching us.
Yeah. So we have a tendency to flip between a couple perspectives. And one of the perspectives is the wholeness of things. Another perspective is the individuality of things. And we hold these in opposition, and we switch between them to try to solve our worries and our problems and our suffering of one kind or another. So oftentimes we look at the world, we were talking about all of the great suffering and fear that I think many people are in. It feels like we're in a time of a lot of change, and volatility maybe is a better word just than change. And how do we face that? So one of the things very natural for us is, in a spiritual practice, is to try to shift to the perspective of wholeness, right? We're like, yeah, this is all pretty messed up, right? But let's take a big perspective, and then everything will be okay, right? Like if we can get far enough away and kind of look at it from enough of a distance. I mean, there's going to be a supernova sooner or later. Later, probably. I mean, defined by human lifespans, it's later. So we can kind of chill out because we go to that whole perspective. But that's actually a big dodge, right? Because the wholeness perspective, when we utilize it in that way, is just we choose the wholeness over the particularity. And there's no medicine comes to the particular suffering that's happening. We just sort of deflate or move back from things. On the other side, we might move to only thinking about the problem within the confines of what the problem is. And so if we look at something like, big question about global warming, and real certain difficulty that is coming from that and will continue to come from that, we tend to then draw a box around global warming, try to, finagle the politics of it so that the box is written in the way that seems correct to me, or kind of heads in the direction that I want to. And all creativity starts coming out of any kind of real attention to responsiveness starts to drain out of it. It can only as a drive towards what I've defined within that particular problem. Okay? So the reason I'm bringing those two up is it's important for us to recognize that kind of tendency in this, whether it's a really big problem or it's just it's a kind of very personal problem that seems more individual. We tend to go between those two places. The fact of the matter is that the wholeness and the particularity are not at odds with each other at all. In fact, the only reason there can be anything in particular is because of the whole, and the only way there can be the whole is because of the particular. And that a lot of or if we wanted to speak in more religious terms, all of the suffering comes from that basic misunderstanding and the dynamics that come from that pushing and pulling between those kind of oppositions. So when we sit in meditation, we're not just trying to get our mind clean or like in one place or something. We're not trying to hold it somewhere, although that sometimes is necessary for a while to put some effort into holding it somewhere. What we're trying to do is we're trying to enact that fact of the inseparability of the whole and the particular. That's what this is. So this circle that we put here, we call the cosmic mudra. Cosmic is such a cosmic word. in the Chinese, Hokai means like the Dharma Dhatu or the Dharma world, which means cosmos. It means the everything of everythingness. The wholeness of wholeness. Like if you could think of what would be the whole of everything and then say, okay, even wholer than that, right? That's the term. It's a technical Buddhist term. And so this mudra is that, but it's made right here with our hands. And right here in this kind of enshrining this sacred place in our body, the center of our being. But this circle then means there's one here. There's a circle here. That same mudra is here. And then that mudra is really made with your whole body. And then we make it in the way that we sit together in the Sangha. And then that circle is just on every level that circle exists. And so that's the medicine which Buddhism is offering us, is an enactment of that. And we do it in meditation or in other spiritual practices. Then we can also bring that to our life in a more general sense. We can think in a different way. That produces other possibility of how to deal with the difficulty that when I'm caring for something very particular, I'm caring for the whole, right? And if I want to care, if I want to really care for the whole, I have to come to the particular. But if the particular is just trapped in my narrow understanding of what it is, I won't really be able to care for it. I won't be able to pay attention to it, actually. I'll just force myself on it, and we've all had people in our lives like that. Have we? who know the answer for you. And when they force it on you, there may be something to learn from it, but actually they might have a very good understanding. They might understand very well, but it's not going to work like that. Yeah. So I will have my daughter listen to this talk. I was talking with her about something yesterday, and I was getting a little too dad about it. So, yeah, I suppose that's it.
Uh-huh. One of the other things that we've had, talks that we've had since the last answer, a response, question and response, was the gentleman who came and visited us from Japan.
Oh, yeah,
monastery in Japan.
Yeah.
He gave a wonderful, very moving, wonderful talk about what his training was like. Is that a monastery that he was in? Can you tell me? What is it? Yeah.
So Tatsudo grew up in a family temple on Shikoku Island, which is the kind of south southeast of Japan, really beautiful place. And so he grew up in a family temple there. His teacher and is also his father. And then he went away to university and did different things.
Right.
And then is the way, if you're going to take over leadership in the temple, you have to go for monastic training. And everyone goes for different amounts of time. So he went to Eiheiji Monastery. Someone in his shoes typically would stay for a year. That's the most common, sometimes a couple years. But he went, and I think he took to it. And so he wasn't planning on staying longer, but one of the teachers there, it's a little like Hogwarts. You know, there's like the head guy, and then there's all these other teachers. So one of those teachers who he became close to said, "Hey, why don't you stay for this longer program, which is a 5-year program?" So he's at Eiheiji, was a head monastery, and he's in his partway through his 2nd year.
Thank you. That wasn't my question, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I'm giving context to everyone.
I know, Dan. Okay. My question was this. When he talked, he explained the benefits of his training and how his cohort of other trainees developed relationships with each other that they carried throughout the rest of their lives in their leadership of other temples.
Yeah, yeah.
He also talked about the gift that he was given as to tend to the grave of the
Founder.
founder. Okay, very, very important things.
Yeah.
When asked, he said that no, women were not allowed in this temple, and neither were they allowed in the second temple of the same status to train. I guess my question is this: is that seen as a problem? And if it's seen as a problem that women are not allowed to train the way that nuns are not allowed to train as diligently and as powerfully as monks, is that a problem? And if it is seen as a problem, is there a solution to that? And what is that solution?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, it is seen as a problem by some, mostly by Westerners, not by Japanese people. So maybe that's the first part of the question. The second part would be, it's important to understand that it is not that women cannot train as rigorously. The women's monasteries are actually known for being tougher than the men's monasteries. So it's not a question of rigor. There are other questions, but it's not a question of the rigorousness of the practice or the respect that's afforded to that. Now, if you go back 100 years, it would be different. Yeah? So there's been a lot of progress in the realm of respecting women monastics and caring for their place within the tradition. A lot of movement. What has not happened, and I think is a very big question within I would say, for us, the answer to the question seems obvious. Yeah, men and women should train together. But in Japan, that is not even really seen as a question. That's seen as a fundamental break of the tradition, which from a Buddhist perspective is. So they're not just making that up. From the time of throughout all of Buddhism, men and women have been separated in their training, particularly as the renunciates or the monastics. So it's not just simply a kind of particular place and time and culture where there's a lot of patriarchy and the men and women are separated. This is throughout the whole tradition. So in the modern day Japan, nuns make up 3% of the clergy, and so that's quite a small number. It's not fluctuating too much from what I understand. There are many temples. Most of the people who become the next leaders of the temples, the monks, are sons of the current abbots, that's the most typical way. There are plenty of people like me who didn't come from that situation who enter in, but that's the dominant model. Many of those families have daughters, and mostly the daughters are not encouraged or interested in becoming priests. There are some exceptions. We had a nun that stayed with us a couple years ago named Shinsho. She grew up in a family temple, much like Katsudo, and she's trained and will become the next abbot of her temple, the family temple she grew up in. So that does happen. So I guess I'm saying all that and just to kind of give a context of what's happening within Japan. And so those training monasteries are largely thought of now as the place that you train to take over these other temples. And the division by gender is really, really strong and not seen as a problem. In the West, I don't think we have any place that separates for practice in that way, other than there's one women's monastery that I know of where men are not allowed to train in this tradition. In some of the Vajrayana traditions is different. But that's largely disappearing in North American Zen. And it has its own struggles, it has its own difficulties. I think it's a good thing. I'm glad that we're doing it that way here. And I think that another kind of culture of Buddhism is developing here in the West that reflects our concern with that kind of imbalance. I do get really what would be the word? Well, I find it problematic when from our perspective of right and wrong in the West, we make a strong assessment of what is happening there. Women are very powerful in Japan, and there's a lot of patriarchy and a lot of discrimination against women. But in some ways, women have more power in a Japanese situation than they do in the North American situation. And part of that comes from the real care and valuing of women's roles within society, traditional roles that were ascribed to women, which I think was devalued here through a process of trying to overcome that kind of discrimination. So it's very complex, and so I am always rooting for the nuns in Japan, and a little bit, especially when the monks, the male monastics, are dismissive of them, I think is a problem. That's really going away. Like when I first was training in Japan, that was still pretty strong. And now I can see that the younger monks are really in a totally different headspace than their teachers and their fathers were. And so I think that's wonderful. Whether that's going to result in a lot more women monastics or not, it's hard to say. In the time of Dogen, when Eiheiji was founded, there were some women who trained there. That was a really different situation. In one way, it's the same, but they were lifelong monastics, that meaning they were renunciates, they didn't have families, and they lived at the monastery for long periods of time. Someone like Katsudo is living there for a huge amount of time compared to most people, other than the teachers that teach there, right? So that's only 5 years. So in time of Eiheiji, when it was founded, the community came together and they lived together for many, 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 many years. And there was a culture about how to work with that. There were also very different ages. There's something about like 223-year-old young men, which itself is just an obstacle. And so it was a very kind of different environment. But sometimes people will say that, Dogen was a big supporter of women's equality in practice, and how could that be more further realized within the institution? I think in the West we have our own understanding of that, and we're really doing it.
And we have, how is it working in the West? I mean, it's working better in the West.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what percentage do you think of nuns, priests?
I don't have the statistics in my hand right now, but maybe 10 years ago or so, the Soto Zen Buddhist Association, which is one of the larger Soto Zen organizations in North America, did a poll of that, and I think it's pretty 50-50. If you go by leadership roles, there's maybe 8 presidents of Soto Zen Buddhist Association so far. 2 were men, 6 were women. abbots of temples, famous teachers, many, many, many women. So it feels quite balanced to me. In the early days, it wasn't, but I think there's been a big shift in that arena. So, of course, there's always things to address. There's always things we need to unpack and uncover and figure out how to address more carefully, more skillfully. But I think overall it is going well. I would say, frankly, right now, my personal concern is more for the men. I think that men are very confused, and this gender stuff is all very. Just take it with a grain of salt. I'm talking in a binary, realizing it's not a binary. But I think that we have largely lost an understanding of what it means to have a voice, and how do we do that in a way that's skillful, which I think was inevitable and appropriate that we lost that because it was a dominating voice, so marked by a dominating quality. And so there, I think that refinding of that voice for men, particularly who are younger and trying to figure out what it means to express themselves and live through their intention, that's really important, and we got to put our eyes on that. Yeah, as a longtime educator, schools are not, and they were never exactly made for boys. And in the time that I was an educator, between the early 2000s to almost 2020, like that 20-year period, is criminal. Yeah.
Right, put a 6-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl in the classroom together, and yes, it's punishment for the boy.
Yeah, and in the way, and it depends. Everyone, there's a range. It's all a Venn diagram, but but that piece, I think, within our tradition, we also have to think about that. There was lots and lots of work to try to round out and to bring forward a richness which was not so defined by the kind of like sharp sword samurai ethic about things. But that sharp sword samurai ethic is also really important. That doesn't belong to men or women, right? But we did some work to try to round that out again, which was appropriate, but we also need that. And so how do we keep that in the tradition? That's a big question for the West. And part of that comes down to the real difficulty of how we recognize gender and work with it.
May I speak to this?
Sure.
If you would allow me to speak to this question of gender. I found it very interesting at the SCBA conference, which I got to attend this year, that of my generation, a third, closer to a quarter, closer to I'd say 41%, a third of the priests in training, and also some transmitted priests were identified as non-binary, queer, or trans in some way. And I feel this is really important to bring up, because we often have this conversation about gender, and we locate it primarily in a binary, which is actually becoming much more changed by myself included as a non-binary person. But a subject that was so interesting about meeting this sort of young group of priests was that there is a sense that really in our tradition there is a strong place for the expression of gender that is not simply the objects we imagine, which are male and female. Avalokiteshvara, for example, is a very, very strong embodiment of a trans or queer presence. And something that I think is really interesting about this dynamic is that looking at monastic communities or the history of monastic communities, this has been a huge place of refuge for queer people throughout Western religions and in Eastern religions. And I feel like that we often erase that history in an attempt to try and only keep gender within this binary spectrum. And that history is incredibly rich and beautiful, and the kinds of stories in our tradition and also in Catholic traditions about queer individuals who are monastics is something I want to take the mantle to highlight more.
Yeah, thank you. I would say also I think that the within Japanese society, for example, we could say this in our own, although it's shifting a lot, that binary quality of gender provides a structure for genderqueer people to thrive. That's a little bit counterintuitive, and it has its own problems. But so if you take, for example, like where I trained, which was a male training environment, there had been women who trained there before, but it was very rare, and it wasn't while I was there. There were several of the monks that were really queer, genderqueer, and the articulation of it as a male space actually allowed a room for that may have been different if it was a very male and female space. And I think you could find the same thing in the female training monasteries as well. So that's a dynamic that's a little underappreciated, I'd say, especially in the Western justice mentality, where our sense of righteousness oftentimes just breaks things because we want it to be a flat field. And the flat field doesn't keep a lot of rain off. Or snow. And I think that's a dynamic that we just have to pay attention to. I'm not saying it's bad. We need to call out things we need to call out, but sometimes our way of thinking about it is just way too simplistic. But thank you for that.
Hold yourself. Could you talk a little bit about working with compulsions? You know, those. Yeah, and you know, we all have those ones that no matter how much we keep seeing into them, it changes, but it's so hard to, and kind of that, like, what is it, not trying to split it into one thing or the other kind of way to work.
Yeah, well, I'm very fond of saying, my practice is to keep my vices in front of me. Which is different than getting rid of them. And so that's one aspect. And a compulsion is not always about a vice. Although if we redefine vice a little bit, pretty much compulsions are kind of a way to indulge a particular pattern, which gives us a sense of security or a sense of something. Maybe just in the fundamental sense, it lets us have a sense of a solid self. And that is kind of worth the admission, or at least we think it is, even if the compulsion is something that's difficult or mostly causes suffering in some way. So I think we could say that's one of the principles. How do we keep them in front of us? What I mean by keeping them in front of us is oftentimes we label these things as bad, and as soon as we label them as bad, they will start to go behind us because we don't want them. Other thing we might do with them is we might just hold them in front of us as bad. And that's a trickier thing because what we start doing is we start just looking at the bad, but the actual thing slips behind us. So we think we're keeping it in view, but we're not really keeping it in view. We're just kind of holding on to the idea of bad. So keeping in front of us is not so easy and sometimes looks like indulgence. I mean, from one perspective, especially if you've labeled it bad. Once you've labeled it bad, if you're doing it, you will automatically define it as indulgence in some way. If you're letting it happen, or I found myself doing X, Y, or Z, all that kind of thing. So it is a subtle thing to say, no, I'm not going to hide from these. Maybe that would be a better way to do it. I'm going to try to keep them in front of them, keep them in front of me. What that then allows is a different kind of working with than just trying to get rid of them, because they are not a thing which is separate from us, which could be cut off. They are our heart in the shape of this thing which causes suffering, which is, guess what, most of your life, on one level or not another. Right? So the issue is not to try to get rid of it. The issue is, what am I going to do with that shape of this heart or this consciousness? And so if I don't allow, then the thing can never reshape. And I'm just in that kind of battle with it all the time. So that's kind of conceptual. But then when it comes down to the kind of meeting the compulsion itself, if you don't have that attitude, you just immediately, you're either going to indulge it or you're going to deny it, and you're just caught in that dynamic. And so when you're coming up to the work of actually feeling the energy of it, then you need that you need that attitude to be able to work with it. I find that embodied practices are really key in trying to investigate what these compulsions are trying to teach us. Because they're usually trying to teach you something too. That's the other point. You don't want to just cut it off because you're not going to learn from it. But if you can take that regard or attitude for the compulsion that's keeping in front of you, and then just stay present and actually feel something. Because so much what the compulsion is trying to do is get you to project yourself into the compulsion so you don't feel something. But if you feel something in that place, then it can get pretty wild ride, right? Like your whole nervous system is just insisting that this thing must happen or else. And you don't know what's on the other side of or else. You just feel the and that's a place where meditation, particularly breathing exercises, walking, all these kind of things that we practicing all the time, they become an asset, not to banish the compulsion, but to learn from it there. I mean, it's basically a hungry ghost ceremony, right? That we're doing. We're just we're giving our attention. And in that nourishment that we're offering, we start waking up to this is a compassion which I'm being afforded. So I talk a pretty good talk. How does that work on the ground? I'm still working with that. And I'm actually, I think, if I say what has changed for me over years and years of practice is, I have unlocked some of those compulsions, and I'm really happy to. But there's a bigger prize. And the bigger prize is, I like unlocking compulsions now. I want to do that. I don't want to stop doing that. Whereas before it was if I could just get rid of this compulsion, everything would be fine. It's no, you'll get rid of that compulsion, there'll be another one. And that was disappointing. But over long practice, now it's not exactly exciting, but it's a little oh, sweet, there's another, natty dread to untangle. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've been having, and reading the Lotus Sutra and seeing the continual turning of the three wheels and just lots of imagery and then, but now I'm thinking, how do we, are we really turning who's turning these three wheels? And are we really bringing all beings to the Dharma just by this turning of the three wheels? It's just kind of this imagery in my head of these heavy wooden wheels or these giant golden wheels, and I just wanted to express some of that because it just seems to keep coming up.
Yeah, here comes 2025. Yeah. I once had a vision a couple of years ago of this. I'll share you my wheel. It was this massive stone wheel that's flat, and all on the wheel there are these grooves that were cut in all kinds of shapes, and these massive stone boulders, very perfectly round, they're balanced in those grooves, and the whole thing's turning, and according to the turning, the boulders are finding their way almost like a maze. And they'll stop someplace for a while, and then as the turning happens, they will go this way. And then right at the middle, there's this a hole, totally black hole. And there was someone who took me there, and we just went and we looked down into the black hole. So that's my wheel. But the reason I'm telling you that is because it comes to me a lot, actually. That image comes back to me a lot. But this is how it is to study a sutra like the Lotus Sutra. That if you open your mind, which means open your imagination, to what may appear through the encounter with this ancient and very powerful text, not just as type on a page, but as a living entity. The Lotus Sutra is living. then you will start to have that. And for you, you're a more visual person, that kind of thing comes to you. Other people will be different. It might appear as a kind of philosophical dynamic that's in them, or it might appear as a beautiful lines from the sutra or certain things like that. But the thing to do with that is don't try to spend too much time like figuring it out. But the way that you're kind of chewing on it and asking the question is, what are we doing? You know, is this actually altering everything? That's the way to keep going forward, to keep asking that question, and then see what is shown to you. So today you asked the question, and I told you about the wheel I saw, and then maybe I would say one other thing that might help feed your question. Is this title of one of Dogen Zenji's writings in the Shobo Genzo is called the Hokke Ten Hokke, which means the lotus flower turns the lotus flower. Quite very beautiful. And the lotus flower turning the lotus flower. We could also say, who could be turning the lotus flower other than a lotus flower? This is part of the magic of the Lotus Sutra teaching. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fathom the truth. So what a Buddha is cannot be singularized, but a Buddha also is a totally whole. That's the kind of thing that our brain can't really deal with, because it uses this way of separating. It's either everything or it's the Buddha. But this is kind of leading us into that other direction. So yeah, we'll just keep going with that and keep seeing those things. And as you come to them with a kind of reverence and respect, they will get a little bit less just kind of disorienting. When you first live in those images a bit, it could be disorienting. You're not sure what's happening, and then as they become more familiar to you, they start being orienting. Yeah, as much as a black hole can be orienting.
You were speaking about how important the Lotus Sutra was in the Tendai tradition and how Dogen broke off to make the Soto school.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to understand, I know so little of the history, like the importance of that.
Yeah.
And the only thing that I could imagine, not having done enough reading, is that like concentrating on the text and on that particular mystical and fantastical was a distraction from the Gnostic experience. And I'm wondering if you can just say maybe more about the context of that transition.
So it was, I would say, the Tendai school, what marks the Tendai school is its total comprehensive approach. So the founding ancestor of the school in China was one of these big minds that will map everything. Has a very comprehensive map of how all of the Buddhist practices and Dharma will fit together. And that became part of the Tendai school's approach. As a result, many different practices are really alive in the Tendai school. A little bit like in Catholicism, whereas because there's this big, the Holy See, right? So it's fine. You can have some, wild Franciscans over here doing Zen meditation and whatever, as long as they don't pipe up about it too much. They're not going to get in too much trouble. So you can think of Tendai Buddhism was similar in that way. A lot of different practices in different facets of the school and lineages within the school, and a kind of comprehensive view of everything. So Dogen actually started to study Zen underneath a teacher named Eisai, who was one of the first Japanese monks to go to China and learn Zen, receive a transmission through a Zen lineage, and bring it back to Japan. He remained a Tendai monk, and Dogen studied underneath him. But the bigger current that was happening at that time was usually when the institution gets too big and has a lot of overreaching power and everything, they start getting a little stinky. and people start relying on a particular perspective too much. At that time, there's a very strong reliance on a perspective called original enlightenment, which is very strong in the Tendai teaching, which says everything is enlightenment. We are enlightenment. It's not that we have enlightenment. We are. Enlightenment is expressed. The Buddha's body, the Dharma body of the Buddha is expressed right here as all beings. So, sweet. That became the interpretation of original enlightenment was. There's nothing to do. There's nothing to be done because everything's already enlightened, which was an imbalanced perspective. And Dogen kept asking the question. He said, if there's original enlightenment, if everything is itself enlightenment, why did all of these ancestors we read about grind their bones to dust practicing? It doesn't make any sense. And he kept asking it. He wasn't getting any answers that made sense to him. This is the mythology of it anyway. And so that was what drove and animated his practice. And that's why his central teaching, we can see, his question, which drove him for years and years and years and years, where he came to was not an answer to the question, but a way of living. And the way of living is, he said, don't divide practice and enlightenment. If you divide the two, if you say enlightenment is original, then practice disappears. And he said, the reason all those ancestors lived that way was not because they were trying to, chased after enlightenment. They were living the life of enlightenment. The life of enlightenment looks like practice. And so he shifted the kind of cognitive way to think about it, and that became the real approach. The Tendai school had a portion of it, which was a kind of Vajrayana type, which became strong in Japan, not in China as much, but in Japan. And but interestingly enough, when people study I'm not a scholar of this, but the little bit I've poked into it, there's not a lot of tantra in it. Tantra meaning like very complex visualizations and those kinds of things. There's some, but it's a different kind of esotericism than tantric esotericism. And so I don't really, Dogen definitely has some pretty high level woo-woo. So there's definitely woo-woo in there, just as a general word. But it's not so specifically that kind of tantric visualization, etc.
Speaking of wheels, or magical wheels, this spring we had Tibetan monks visiting, and we were lucky to have them. We had some tea, and several people here, including Issei and Daoran and Yuton were here. And they were touring the country doing rituals, creating the mandalas, sand mandalas for healing. And the reason I bring it, several reasons. One, cyclically, I connected with your wheel. And the other is mostly what we do is in a building or on the grounds. And we don't go to the public, we don't seek alms, but in Japan we seek alms. Shall we develop something?
Yeah, sounds good. Do you have any ideas?
We will.
Yeah. It is a real conundrum in Western Buddhism. And it's one of the reasons that we've stayed so true to the approach of not charging for things. Isn't just because there's a lot of good effects of that. Like anybody who wants to come, they can put their life together in a way to be able to come, can just come. We don't have to worry about money. So that's a good effect. But that's not the reason. The reason's more primary than that. The reason is what you're bringing up. Is there really is no separation? Like, where are you going to put the booth to charge the money? There's no place to put it. There's no place where, there's no compound in which entrance or exiting could be cut off or be allowed or disallowed according to X, Y, or Z. So the reason that's so important is this is just it's just a point. It barely occupies any space at all, if we could even say it occupies any space. And the whole cosmos is that wheel right around here. But that's not just true of the Buddha-I temple. Right? That's true of a fire hydrant, and it's true of Nathaniel's fuzzy hat. It's true of everything. That's how it exists. That's how everything exists. Or how everything exists, maybe it's too clunky of a word. That's how everything is. So, so that way that in the West, for Buddhist institutions to survive, we mostly didn't take up the traditional way of just living on alms. And so that has created, how do you express that total indivisibility through the institution? So I think we did a pretty good job here with that. But that's a very implicit. If you ask people, like in this neighborhood, for example, we have very good relationship with people in this neighborhood, and because there's no outside the temple. It's not like there's the temple in the neighborhood. It's just we're all together. And but that all kind of is more implicit. What's the explicit form of it? How do we express that more in a way that can be seen more? It can be seen, because right now it can't really be seen. Yeah.
One point that interests me is what they're practicing is the religion, but also art.
Yeah.
And when they bring it to the public, many people can relate.
Yeah.
They don't say, "Oh, it's Buddhist," or it's this, or that. What's going on? This is amazing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's very interesting.
Great. You're going to love on the 2025 12-year vision matrix. This thing actually exists. And on one of the lines is called community engagement. And on the first phase is exploring what kind of art we could be doing with the community to do exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. So we'll look forward to that.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Okay, maybe time for one more if there is anyone. Otherwise, we can have coffee.
Oju-san,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the altar.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could speak to the tall rectangular box behind you on the second tier with the gold. And the
Yeah, sure. So that is called the Rishubun. It is a keystone sutra of the Prajnaparamita collection of sutras. So the Prajnaparamita collection of sutras, that's the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, and they come in a lot of different sizes. So it's the same teaching, but in different scales. So the Heart Sutra that we chant on Sunday mornings, the Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, that Heart Sutra is one of the very short versions of Prajnaparamita teachings. The very long one is if you come on New Year's when we fan the sutras. Have you been here when we fan the sutras before? Well, come on Wednesday. And that one is the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines. So it's 600 volumes. That's the longest version. So those teachings are just amazing, foundational teaching of Mahayana Buddhism. The icon that book is sitting next to is Prajnaparamita personified as the mother of the Buddhas. So this text, usually she has this text close to her, or Prajnaparamita text close to her. On the lotus flower that is right beside her, there's a scroll. If you go close, you'll be able to see it. That's a Prajnaparamita scroll. So here we have this text that's next to it. By keystone is meant that this was a text that's valued in some of the esoteric schools, or esoteric parts of the stream of our school. And it seemed to be not so much a kind of like explanatory summary of all of the Prajnaparamita. It is like, it literally means the going beyond the principle is the title of the text. So it's like all of the understanding you could have of what the principle is or anything that you could explain about it. It's like that. Just like, go. Don't get no conceptual understanding. Don't get bogged down in all of that stuff. It's just go through. So it gets used ritually a lot. Studied. Not many people study it. I've taken up the study of it, but it's mostly used as a ritual. And so every day we fan that text in the lunch, right before lunch. But then for big ceremonies like New Year's, we bring out the 100,000 line version and we fan those. It gets a lot. It gets a wind. Part of it is the wind of the Dharma. moving the wind of the Dharma. You can think about that with the fanning of the books. There's a kind of this wind happening. It's like a way to just throw the sutras to themselves because they're everywhere. But we put them in books and we think we know what that is, but we don't. So you take them sometimes and you just, it's like throwing the sutra back into the world. Like it becomes all the trees and the grass and the birds and the sun and everything, which is what it is to begin with. But we get confused and we think it's inside the book, so we have to throw it out. Yeah, every once in a while. And that dynamic we can call the Dharma wind. That's how it lives through our heart and is transformative for us, is to be doing that. That's what we're doing all the time, right? You know, we hear some teaching, we think like, oh, it's this Buddhist teaching. It's not a Buddhist teaching, actually. It's just, you know, it's the cat's teaching or the flower's teaching or everything's teaching. So we have to kind of throw it out as our life. And then as we're throw it out, not throw it out like in the garbage, but throw it out as our life. That's what we call practicing. We're throwing it out into the world with our flesh and blood. And it's rejoining with its source, which is all the stuff we thought wasn't it. We thought it was this thing we read. So that's a little bit unpacking the compulsions kind of thing too. That can be a little treacherous and a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. But then as you start to see the value of it, then it's like, can we shake those books again? You know, like that becomes exciting. Like that's the impulse, is to keep questioning and keep throwing it out there. Yeah. So that one right there, I will never stop talking about that. So you could say that's my explanation for today, and anything you ever hear me say from now until I'm dead will be the continuation of response to that question. Well, I hope folks will be able to make time on New Year's Day. So I believe that's Wednesday. Is that right? Wednesday, and we is it noon?
We said noon.
We said noon. It's always floating around every year, but noonish. Noon.
It won't be earlier than noon. It won't be.
It won't be earlier than noon. It probably won't be later than 12:15, but somewhere in that area. And anyway, the ceremony we do is powerful and relatively short. So if you have family and friends who might be interested in coming, it's not like there's not going to be an hour meditation period or something like that involved with it, and it's quite festive. And then we enjoy the traditional Japanese New Year's Day food, with mochi and soup, two kinds of soup, sweet bean soup, and then a broth soup that's made from, it's all vegetarian, vegan actually. It's made from what do you call those things? Mushrooms. Mushroom and seaweed broth, and soy sauce. That kind of thing.